Hi, this is AJ. I'd like to do something a little different this time. Instead of talking about something I watched, I want to talk about a movie that doesn't exist yet. I'd like to make a very serious pitch for a Jason Statham Star Wars movie. And what I mean by that really is a Jason Statham revenge flick set in the Star Wars universe, where Jason Statham could be a dark Jedi, and if you're not familiar, that's a Force user who's not actually a Jedi, and they're not a Sith either, they're just some unaffiliated dark side Force user. So he would have his own agenda and his own rules, and he's playing the main character in a revenge flick here, so we're rooting for him, and all the people he's killing have it coming. And that's really what I'm picturing, is him killing a lot of people. 2 hours of Jason Statham chopping people in half with a lightsaber and using his dark force powers to choke people out and throw stuff around. And Jason Statham is trained in multiple styles of martial arts, so you can always work that into the fight scenes whenever you want, especially if you have a scene where he can't get to his lightsaber for some reason. And if it was done right, it could be a hell of a lot of fun. I really think it is pretty hard to screw up a Jason Statham revenge flick. You know, if you've got a movie about Jason Statham out for revenge, you have to give him a terrible script and terrible lines, and just almost like you have to be trying to fail to make it not be at least watchable. And you can have this movie be set in the Star Wars universe and yet still be its own thing. It doesn't really have to be connected to the original trilogy or the prequels or any of the Skywalker stuff, really. It doesn't need to be filled with member berries or references to other things. You don't need to have cameos from characters from other movies or shows showing up here with de-aged faces or whatever. You don't have to have this be connected to the sequels. It doesn't have to be a setup to anything. It doesn't have to be a setup to some new Disney Plus show. It can just be its own thing, where a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Jason Statham killed the shit out of everyone. And it doesn't need to have its own sequels. Not everything needs to be a goddamn trilogy. It can just be a nice, simple, fun one-off. Not some empty shell of a movie that's going to be filled with cameos from other things. How about you make something interesting enough and fun enough to watch that people are going to want to see those characters show up as cameos in other things? How about we do that for a change? And speaking of interesting characters, I'd really like to see Anya Taylor-Joy in a supporting role in this movie. Not as a Jedi or as a Sith or any kind of Force user, just someone who knows certain things and maybe has a very particular set of skills that Jason Statham's character ultimately realizes could help him carry out his revenge. And maybe she has her own agenda and her own code that she follows and her own reasons for cooperating with him to get whatever she wants to get out of his revenge. And Anya Taylor-Joy can definitely handle action. She's done it before, but she's a good actress. You don't necessarily need to have her be a fighter. You can have her particular set of skills be that she's incredibly intelligent. Maybe she has an off-the-charts IQ, and she's very resourceful and clever, and maybe even a little witty. You can always give her some good lines to say when you need a moment of levity in a movie. And Anya Taylor-Joy is almost 30 years younger than Jason Statham, so I really hope they avoid making the mistake of trying to set up some sort of romantic subplot. They don't need to be making goo-goo eyes at each other in between all the fight scenes and the action set pieces and all the stuff that's happening. This is a movie that's about revenge. It's not a romantic comedy. Maybe save that stuff for Katherine Heigl's Star Wars movie. And you can always decide to have Anya Taylor-Joy playing some kind of alien, maybe an alien race we've seen before, maybe one we've not seen before. You can always have it be some new thing if you want, or hey, she could always just be a very interesting human. Such things do exist in the Star Wars universe. Or if you really want to get out there, you could always have her playing a droid who looks like a human, which isn't something you normally see in a Star Wars movie. In Star Wars, the droids tend to look very much like droids. But I don't know that you really want to open that can of worms. Once something like that happens, it can't really unhappen. But whatever you decide to do with Anya Taylor-Joy, just give her a really well-written character and give her some good lines, and she'll give you a great performance. And I'm sure she'd be great opposite Jason Statham. And as far as the villain of the movie goes, at least the main villain, because there would be several minor villains getting killed off along the way, but as far as the main villain goes, I'd like that to be maybe some kind of droid, which isn't something you normally see in a Star Wars movie. There's always droids in Star Wars movies, but they're usually either some cute, cuddly sidekick that's there for comic relief mostly, or there's some droid that's just following their programming. What I'd really like to see is a droid that's just kind of doing its own thing and has itself set up as a crime lord in its own little wretched hive of scum and villainy in some far-flung corner of the galaxy. And maybe the droid could have an interesting look, an interesting design. Might even be made out of something lightsaber resistant like Beskar steel, or It might even be made out of cortosis or reinforced with cortosis somehow, that metal that can actually disable a lightsaber. Or it might have some other totally different, unique way of dealing with the logistical problem of lightsabers. Because it's a lot easier to do crime and you don't have to worry so much about getting chopped in half with a lightsaber. And as far as who should be the voice of this villain, the first name that comes to mind for me is Clancy Brown. I mean, he's got an amazing voice. One of the best voices in the business, really. And he's a great actor. I mean, he always makes an impression on me. He definitely made an impression on me the first time I ever saw him in anything, which was, I think, the first Highlander movie. And he's very good at playing the bad guy. But as good as his voice is, it's very distinctive. And you kind of always know it's him when he shows up in something because his voice is so distinctive. And he's been used before in some other Star Wars things. He did some voiceover work in the Clone Wars, and he did some voiceover work in Star Wars Rebels. And he showed up in some live-action things. He played a Deveronian mercenary named Berg in a fantastic episode of The Mandalorian. And in Ahsoka, he shows up as the live-action version of the character he did the voice for in Star Wars Rebels. So Clancy Brown might be the first name that comes to mind for me, but I think he might have already hit his quota here, so he might not be the best choice. Another name that comes to mind for me, and maybe a more interesting choice, is Stephen McKinley Henderson, who's a great actor. I mean, I absolutely loved his performance in the movie Civil War. I love him anytime I see him in anything. He always gives a great performance. And unlike Clancy Brown, he hasn't been in any Star Wars movies or shows before or anything to do with Star Wars. And he hasn't even done any kind of voice acting before for anything, which surprises me because he actually has a pretty great voice, I think. Whether or not you can convince him to be the voice of an evil robot in a Jason Statham Star Wars movie is another question. And if Stephen McKinley Henderson turns out not to be available, a pretty strong choice, and maybe a more conventional choice, would be Jeremy Irons as the voice of the villain. And Jeremy Irons hasn't been in any Star Wars stuff before, but he's done plenty of voice acting, and he's not afraid to play the bad guy or chew the scenery while he's doing it. But even when he's hamming it up, he always gives a good performance. I mean, there's a reason he won an Oscar and several other awards. He's a great actor. I don't think I've ever seen him give a bad performance in anything. And as an added bonus, he's actually worked with Jason Statham before. Jeremy Irons played one of the antagonists in the Jason Statham movie, The Beekeeper. But the real question is, if you're going to make a Jason Statham Star Wars movie, who should write and direct? I happen to think Sam Raimi would be a good choice. He's one of my favorite directors. He's competent as hell. And yeah, he got his start in horror originally, but he's comfortable working in a variety of genres. And he's done some Marvel movies. He directed all 3 of the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, and he directed Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which I think is a really underrated MCU film. He also directed Oz the Great and Powerful for Disney, which I know got mixed reviews, but I enjoyed it. So he's very comfortable being at the helm of these sorts of special effects extravaganzas, which is what you want if you've got a movie that's filled with blasters and lightsaber fights and aliens and spaceships and evil robots and all sorts of weird visuals. But Sam Raimi is also a very competent director who respects the audience enough to always be trying to tell us a good story that's filled with interesting characters, regardless of how many special effects there are in the movie and what the budget is. Which is what you also want in a Star Wars movie, or at least what you should want in a Star Wars movie if you want it to be good. There hasn't been anywhere near enough attention put into that sort of stuff in most of the Star Wars things being made these days. I would actually like to see Sam Raimi write the script for this movie with his brother Ivan Raimi. I think they tend to work well together. They both co-wrote the script for the first Darkman movie. Well, they co-wrote it with a few other people because the development process was a bit complicated, but they wrote that together, and I really like that movie quite a bit. I love that Darkman is basically equal parts horror film and superhero movie, and there's lots of little moments of humor sprinkled throughout. And the two of them also wrote the script for Army of Darkness together all on their own. And I love Army of Darkness. To me, that's the best Evil Dead movie that's ever been made, and probably the best Evil Dead movie that ever will be made. And yes, the two of them did write the third Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie together, which did not turn out great, but I think really you can blame the studio for that. They were either trying to force Sam Raimi to make a movie he didn't want to make at all, or to make it in a way he didn't want to make it, and the end result was just not very good. But Darkman in particular, at least as far as the story goes, is the one that really makes me want to suggest Sam Raimi and his brother Ivan. Because in that movie you've got a hero, well maybe hero is the wrong word, you've got a protagonist who's been horribly disfigured and he's basically become a monster, but he doesn't just look like a monster, he's doing monstrous things. but he's doing those monstrous things to some very bad men who definitely have it coming. It's basically a revenge flick, and he's going down the list of people who wronged him and killing them all in some very clever and creative ways, sometimes very funny ways. There's lots of dark humor throughout the movie and elements of horror sprinkled throughout here and there. And of course the character of Ash Williams from the Evil Dead movies is no stranger to violence either. I mean, he's got a chainsaw for a hand, for Christ's sake. I would really love to see what the guys who wrote Darkman and Army of Darkness could come up with if the two of them sat down together and tried to write a script for a Jason Statham revenge flick that also happens to be a Star Wars movie. I really do think that they could come up with something really, really special. And if it's a Sam Raimi movie, you can probably count on Bruce Campbell showing up at some point in some small role. But that's fine. I love Bruce Campbell. I don't mind seeing him show up in all of Sam Raimi's movies. However he wants to use him is fine with me, even if he just is like the voice of some weirdo alien or something. And if it's a Sam Raimi movie, you're probably also going to get Danny Elfman doing the music for the movie, which is fine with me. I'm a huge fan of Danny Elfman, and I've been a big fan of his for years and years and years. I still remember watching the movie Beetlejuice in the theater and just being blown away by the opening theme for the movie, how wonderfully weird it was, and it fit perfectly what was happening on screen. It did a great job of setting the tone for the movie. And I know a lot of people are really hung up on the idea that only John Williams can do the music for a Star Wars movie, but as much as I love John Williams, and I consider him to be basically a genius on the level of Mozart, he's 92 years old, and I really think he's kind of done doing music for Star Wars movies. And this wouldn't be your typical Star Wars movie anyway. It's going to be a Jason Statham revenge flick Star Wars movie directed by Sam Raimi. So yeah, I think Danny Elfman will probably be the perfect guy to do the score for that. Anyway, thanks for listening. If you like what I had to say here, please consider clicking the like or subscribe or sharing on social media, or maybe just leaving a comment down below. And if you've been listening to this for free, please consider becoming a member of my Patreon page at patreon.com/here'swhatIwatched. If you've got a way to read Kindle stuff, please check out some of my short stories at the Amazon Kindle store. There's a collection of short stories called Dark Corners of the Mind, a standalone story called The Clouder, and another standalone story called 3 Guesses. Or you can always just give me a shout over on Twitter. My handle there is @AJWink. Anyway, thanks for listening, stay safe, and see you guys next time.